She was marketed as fertile, but no one believed it or wanted her until a cowboy proved them wrong. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late summer light settled heavily over the trading post at the edge of contested land, washing the wooden buildings in a dull, tired brightness. The ground was hard and cracked, packed down by wagon wheels and hooves that never stayed long. A few men stood near the well, arguing over grain prices. Others leaned against hitching rails, wiping sweat from their foreheads. Horses stamped restlessly, kicking up dust that floated between people before drifting away. Under a warped wooden awning at the far side, an Apache woman stood with her back straight and her wrists loosely tied. The rope was more insult than restraint, rough enough to chafe her skin if she shifted too much. She had been there since morning, watching the shadows change shapes on the ground while trying to keep her breathing steady. The trader who brought her here had tied her up to make her look controlled. In reality, she could have freed herself easily, but doing so would have brought trouble she could not fight in her current state. Her name, Naya, stayed locked inside her mind. She had learned that the last thing she should offer strangers was something that belonged only to her. Her clothes were worn from weeks of travel. Her stomach tightened now and then with hunger. Sweat collected at her temples, and dust clung to her legs. She forced herself not to react to the men who looked at her with bored or mocking eyes. Some asked crude questions, others simply shook their heads. None saw her as a person. The trader kept repeating the same thing whenever someone paused near the awning. "Fertile," he said, waving his hand as if that single word explained everything. That's what the folks said. Don't know if it's true. Probably not. His tone suggested he didn't care. He only wanted coins, and no one was offering any. Naya tried to focus on small details that kept her grounded. The uneven grain of the wooden post beside her, the way worn boots sounded when men walked over loose dirt, the smell of leather from saddles passing too closely. These details stopped her from drifting into panic. Her hands trembled once, a quick involuntary shake that she forced herself to hide. Fear sat at the base of her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had survived worse moments than this one. Across the market, a cowboy arrived leading a bay mare. His name was Richard Hale, a man in his late 30s who had lived alone long enough that silence felt more natural to him than conversation. He had once owned a ranch with his younger brother, but raids, sickness, and bad decisions had left him alone on a small, isolated spread far from town. He came to the trading post only when necessary. Tools, salt, flour, and occasionally a horse part he could not make himself. Today he planned to buy nails, a sack of oats, and nothing else. His main mission in life now was simple: survive the year. Keep the land running. Avoid trouble. Speak only when needed. He had managed that for a long while, until he saw the woman in the shade. Richard noticed her before he even reached the supply stall. It wasn't her appearance that drew his attention. It was the way she held herself. Upright, alert but exhausted. Not broken, not begging, not hiding. Something about the steadiness in her shoulders made him stop walking for a moment. He had seen people crumble under far less strain. She wasn't crumbling. He approached the trading stand without looking directly at her, trying to understand the situation before speaking. He listened to the trader repeat the same dismissive claims. He watched another man laugh after glancing at her wrist rope. Something in Richard's chest tightened with a quiet frustration he didn't show on his face. He finally stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away from Naya. She looked at the ground, but her eyes shifted slightly, tracking his boots. She evaluated strangers quickly now. She watched how they stood, how they breathed, where their hands rested. Richard's hands stayed visible, one resting on his belt, the other hanging loose at his side. He did not move fast. He did not stare. He did not treat her like something to be inspected. "Price?" Richard asked simply. The trader raised his eyebrows. "For her? You serious? She's no use. Folks say things about her. None of it holds up. Take her if you want. Just pay something so I don't lose the day." Richard didn't ask for details. He didn't question the trader's tone or try to verify anything. He saw enough. The woman standing in front of him needed out of this place. And leaving her here would sit wrong in his stomach for the rest of the year. He pulled the required coins from his coat and handed them over. The trader snatched them quickly and stepped aside with a shrug. Richard turned to Naya and loosened the rope with careful movements. When the last knot came undone, the rope fell to the ground. He didn't grab her arm or tell her what to do. He stepped back so she could stand without feeling cornered. "You can walk beside me," he said quietly. "I'm heading out." His voice was low, steady, and unforced. Not a command, not an invitation, just information she could choose to accept or ignore. Naya didn't move for a full second. Her mind worked quickly, testing his sincerity, thinking about the men behind her, thinking about what would happen if she stayed. She realized she had no plan left. Every option she had tried so far had ended in another stranger claiming ownership of her body or her life. This man did not look like he wanted ownership at all. She stepped forward. Richard didn't look at her again until they reached his horse. He handed her a canteen. She hesitated only briefly before drinking. When she returned it, he gave a small nod and mounted the mare. She walked beside him as he guided the horse toward the open land. As a trading post shrank behind them, dust rose in soft trails under Richard's horse. Naya glanced back once, confirming it was truly fading from sight. No one shouted. No one followed. With every step she took, the tension in her shoulders eased a little. Not enough to trust, not enough to feel safe, but enough to breathe. Richard rode in silence, matching her pace without drawing attention to it. For the first time in months, Naya felt the faint sense that she wasn't walking toward another trap. And Richard, who never expected to leave the trading post with anything more than nails and oats, felt the unfamiliar pull of a decision he had made without thinking, but one he knew he wouldn't undo. Late summer light settled heavily over the trading post at the edge of contested land, washing the wooden buildings in a dull, tired brightness. The ground was hard and cracked, packed down by wagon wheels and hooves that never stayed long. A few men stood near the well, arguing over grain prices. Others leaned against hitching rails, wiping sweat from their foreheads. Horses stamped restlessly, kicking up dust that floated between people before drifting away. Under a warped wooden awning at the far side, an Apache woman stood with her back straight and her wrists loosely tied. The rope was more insult than restraint, rough enough to chafe her skin if she shifted too much. She had been there since morning, watching the shadows change shapes on the ground while trying to keep her breathing steady. The trader who brought her here had tied her up to make her look controlled. In reality, she could have freed herself easily, but doing so would have brought trouble she could not fight in her current state. Her name, Naya, stayed locked inside her mind. She had learned that the last thing she should offer strangers was something that belonged only to her. Her clothes were worn from weeks of travel. Her stomach tightened now and then with hunger. Sweat collected at her temples, and dust clung to her legs. She forced herself not to react to the men who looked at her with bored or mocking eyes. Some asked crude questions, others simply shook their heads. None saw her as a person. The trader kept repeating the same thing whenever someone paused near the awning. "Fertile," he said, waving his hand as if that single word explained everything. That's what the folks said. Don't know if it's true. Probably not. His tone suggested he didn't care. He only wanted coins, and no one was offering any. Naya tried to focus on small details that kept her grounded. The uneven grain of the wooden post beside her, the way worn boots sounded when men walked over loose dirt, the smell of leather from saddles passing too closely. These details stopped her from drifting into panic. Her hands trembled once, a quick involuntary shake that she forced herself to hide. Fear sat at the base of her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had survived worse moments than this one. Across the market, a cowboy arrived leading a bay mare. His name was Richard Hale, a man in his late 30s who had lived alone long enough that silence felt more natural to him than conversation. He had once owned a ranch with his younger brother, but raids, sickness, and bad decisions had left him alone on a small, isolated spread far from town. He came to the trading post only when necessary: tools, salt, flour, and occasionally a horse part he could not make himself. Today he planned to buy nails, a sack of oats, and nothing else. His main mission in life now was simple: survive the year. Keep the land running. Avoid trouble. Speak only when needed. He had managed that for a long while, until he saw the woman in the shade. Richard noticed her before he even reached the supply stall. It wasn't her appearance that drew his attention. It was the way she held herself. Upright, alert, but exhausted. Not broken. Not begging. Not hiding. Something about the steadiness in her shoulders made him stop walking for a moment. He had seen people crumble under far less strain. She wasn't crumbling. He approached the trading stand without looking directly at her, trying to understand the situation before speaking. He listened to the trader repeat the same dismissive claims. He watched another man laugh after glancing at her wrist rope. Something in Richard's chest tightened with a quiet frustration he didn't show on his face. He finally stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away from Naya. She looked at the ground, but her eyes shifted slightly, tracking his boots. She evaluated strangers quickly now. She watched how they stood, how they breathed, where their hands rested. Richard's hands stayed visible, one resting on his belt, the other hanging loose at his side. He did not move fast. He did not stare. He did not treat her like something to be inspected. "Price?" Richard asked simply. The trader raised his eyebrows. "For her? You serious? She's no use. Folks say things about her. None of it holds up. Take her if you want. Just pay something so I don't lose the day." Richard didn't ask for details. He didn't question the trader's tone or try to verify anything. He saw enough. The woman standing in front of him needed out of this place. And leaving her here would sit wrong in his stomach for the rest of the year. He pulled the required coins from his coat and handed them over. The trader snatched them quickly and stepped aside with a shrug. Richard turned to Naya and loosened the rope with careful movements. When the last knot came undone, the rope fell to the ground. He didn't grab her arm or tell her what to do. He stepped back so she could stand without feeling cornered. "You can walk beside me," he said quietly. "I'm heading out." His voice was low, steady, and unforced. Not a command, not an invitation, just information she could choose to accept or ignore. Naya didn't move for a full second. Her mind worked quickly, testing his sincerity, thinking about the men behind her, thinking about what would happen if she stayed. She realized she had no plan left. Every option she had tried so far had ended in another stranger claiming ownership of her body or her life. This man did not look like he wanted ownership at all. She stepped forward. Richard didn't look at her again until they reached his horse. He handed her canteen. She hesitated only briefly before drinking. When she returned it, he gave a small nod and mounted the mare. She walked beside him as he guided the horse toward the open land. As the trading post shrank behind them, dust rose in soft trails under Richard's horse. Naya glanced back once, confirming it was truly fading from sight. No one shouted. No one followed. With every step she took, the tension in her shoulders eased a little. Not enough to trust, not enough to feel safe, but enough to breathe. Richard rode in silence, matching her pace without drawing attention to it. For the first time in months, Naya felt the faint sense that she wasn't walking toward another trap. And Richard, who never expected to leave the trading post with anything more than nails and oats, felt the unfamiliar pull of a decision he had made without thinking, but one he knew he wouldn't undo. By late morning, the land began to change. The open flats gave way to a scattered line of cottonwoods, their leaves rattling faintly in the dry breeze. A narrow path wound between low ridges, marked by hoof prints that had faded under weeks of sun. Richard slowed the mare as they approached the final rise, his posture tightening slightly in a way that revealed how he shifted into a protective mindset when nearing home. Naya followed closely, her steps quieter now as she tried to understand the terrain. She scanned the ridges for movement, noting how secluded the area felt. No smoke, no distant voices, no signs of settlements. For a moment, unease tightened her throat. Seclusion could be safety, or it could mean there would be no one to intervene if things went wrong. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket around her shoulders, grounding herself in the choice she had made the night before. At the crest, Richard lifted his chin toward the valley below. "My place is down there." Naya looked where he indicated. A modest ranch sat tucked against the slope, built from thick beams and stones gathered from the surrounding hills. The roof leaned slightly at one end, patched with mismatched wooden shingles. A barn stood nearby, weathered but sturdy, its doors half open and swaying faintly in the wind. A small corral enclosed a few cattle grazing near a trough that looked recently repaired. No decorative touches, no unnecessary structures, just what a man needed to survive. Naya took in the sight slowly, trying to gauge what kind of life unfolded here. It was neither prosperous nor neglected. It was functional, shaped by hands that worked regularly and without complaint. Richard guided the mare down the path, and she stayed beside him, her pace steady despite fatigue pressing at her joints. The quiet around them grew heavier as they descended, making every sound clearer. The creak of leather, the crunch of dirt beneath hooves, the soft rustle of distant grasshoppers. When they reached the yard, Richard dismounted, landing with a controlled drop that told Naya he had spent years moving in silence. He loosened the saddle with practiced precision, running his hand along the mare's neck to check for soreness. She watched how gently he handled the animal, how he murmured a low sound that was more habit than communication. "You can go inside," he said, nodding toward the house. Doors open. Naya paused before stepping forward. Entering a stranger's home meant vulnerability she hadn't chosen in a long time. She studied his posture. He stood beside the horse, not blocking the doorway, not watching her with expectation. He gave her the choice, nothing more. She approached the house with cautious steps and pushed the door inward. A faint whiff of stove smoke lingered in the air. The single room was practical, a bed pushed against the wall, a small stove near the center, a narrow table with two chairs, shell-stocked sparsely with tools and tin plates. Light entered through two windows, illuminating dust that drifted in thin streaks. Naya walked slowly, absorbing every detail. No personal decorations, no signs of another resident, no locked chests or hidden compartments. Just a place shaped by routine and isolation. She sat at the edge of the table, resting her hands on the worn wood. Her heartbeat gradually settled, though her muscles stayed alert, ready to react if needed. She listened to every sound outside, the clank of the water bucket, the scrape of Richard's boots as he moved toward the barn, the soft lowing of cattle on the far side of the yard. Minutes passed before he entered the doorway. He held two buckets, both filled from a well, and set them near the stove. "You can wash if you want. Water's clean," he said, avoiding any tone that could be misunderstood. Naya nodded slightly, but made no move yet. She studied him more openly now. His hair was trimmed short, showing early streaks of gray near his temples. His face carried a few scars, not large but noticeable. His eyes had the steady focus of a man accustomed to shouldering work alone, never waiting for someone else to help. He noticed her hesitation. "No one else lives here. No one comes by unless there's trouble with cattle. That's maybe twice a year." Hearing this, Naya felt a shift inside, a mix of relief and apprehension. Isolation meant fewer threats. It also meant no escape routes beyond the open land. Still, she sensed no aggression from him, no subtle attempt to corner her. His presence remained calm and predictable. Richard placed a sack of flour and a tin of beans on the counter. "Food's plain, but there's enough." He paused, debating whether to add more. After a moment, he said, "You don't owe anything here. Help if you want. Rest if you need." The last sentence caught her off guard. Until now, every place she'd been taken had expected something from her: work, obedience, silence. Hearing she owed nothing triggered a confusing mixture of caution and curiosity. She lowered her gaze to the floor, processing the unfamiliar concept of choice. The midday heat pressed against the walls, and sweat gathered at her hairline. She stood and walked to the bucket, splashing cool water onto her face and arms. The dirt loosened, running down her forearms in thin streams. Richard stepped outside again, giving her privacy without calling attention to it. While she washed, she felt the room differently. Not as a cage, not as a trap, as a place where she might breathe without waiting for the next demand. Outside, Richard hammered a loose board on the corral, his movement steady, his focus entirely on the task. He had lived alone for so long that another person's presence altered the air around him more than he expected. He didn't resent it. He only needed time to navigate the unfamiliar territory of not being by himself. Naya stepped onto the porch, water droplets clinging to her skin. Richard looked up briefly, then returned to his work. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't question her past. He accepted her silence as easily as he accepted his own. She watched him fix the board, noticing the way he checked the wood twice before hammering. She recognized a man who made careful choices, who rarely acted on impulse, who carried a private history heavy enough to shape every step. For the first time, she wondered what kept him isolated out here. Something about the set of his shoulders suggested loss. Not dramatic, not recent, but deep enough to create distance that he rarely bridged. Richard finished the repair and dusted his hands off. "You should rest," he said, not as advice, but as a simple fact. Naya nodded slowly. The day had carried her farther than she expected, from captivity to a place she didn't understand but no longer feared as much. She entered the house again, allowing the quiet to settle around her. Outside, Richard checked the fence line, his figure moving calmly against the wide landscape. Two strangers, each protecting themselves in different ways, now shared the same small corner of the world. What came next was unclear to both of them, but for the moment, neither turned away. The first full morning at the ranch began with a muted gray sky stretching over the valley, carrying the promise of heat that had not yet arrived. Naya woke before Richard, her instincts still tuned to danger and movement. She lay still for a moment, listening to the subtle sounds inside the house. The low crackle of embers left in the stove, the soft click of wood expanding under early warmth, the faint creak of the roof shaken by a passing gust. She sat up quietly, muscles stiff from days of travel, and moved toward the stove to add 2 small pieces of kindling. She kept her steps controlled so the floorboards would not groan under her weight. The fire caught after a few careful adjustments, sending a thin ribbon of heat through the room. Outside, Richard was already working. She could hear the dull thud of an axe striking wood at a slow, even rhythm. His routine had begun before sunrise, checking the animals, hauling water, preparing whatever tasks the day required. His movements were consistent, never rushed, giving the sense that he planned each step long before taking it. When Naya stepped onto the porch, she saw him near the chopping block. Sweat darkened the front of his shirt as he split a log cleanly, then set another in place. He didn't acknowledge her right away, not out of disrespect, but out of not wanting to startle her. When he finally lifted his gaze, he gave a brief nod and returned to the task. Naya watched him work, noticing how his shoulders tightened with each swing and relaxed when the axe connected. He looked self-contained, not lonely, but accustomed to having no one else share the weight of the day. She wondered how long he had lived like this, doing everything alone, carrying every small responsibility as if nobody else could be trusted with it. After a moment, she walked down the steps and picked up a smaller piece of wood from the pile. She carried it inside without comment and arranged it neatly near the stove. She was not trying to repay him. She simply needed something to do, something that kept her hands steady and her mind from circling old memories she wanted buried. When she returned outside, Richard had paused for water. He set the tin cup aside and stood near the corral, looking over the cattle as if counting them for changes he couldn't see yet. She approached slowly, stopping a few paces away. "I can help with some things," she said quietly. His jaw shifted a little, not in surprise, but in the way a man adjusts to a new idea. He folded his arms loosely, studying her expression for any hint of pressure or fear. "Only if you want to," he replied. She nodded once. The agreement was simple and free of expectation, which gave her the first small sense of control she had felt in a long time. He showed her the water buckets beside the well. "Animals drink early. Best to get it done before the heat comes." Naya lifted the first bucket. The weight pulled at her arms, but she steadied herself and carried it toward the trough. The cattle backed up slightly, watching her with mild curiosity. She poured slowly, keeping her motions smooth so the animals wouldn't startle. Richard observed quietly from a distance, noting how she handled the work without hesitation. Throughout the morning, they fell into an unspoken rhythm. She carried water. He secured a loose rail on the corral fence. She gathered kindling near the tree line. He inspected the barn roof for damage from last week's storm. Neither intruded on the other's tasks. Their paths crossed only when necessary, and each time, they exchanged subtle signals. Brief nods, steady eye contact, shifts of posture that indicated understanding without forced conversation. By midday, the sun pressed hard against the valley, pulling sweat from their skin and drying the dirt in brittle cracks. Richard motioned toward the house. "Shade's better inside," he said. They stepped in, leaving the heat behind as the door shut with a solid thump. Richard dropped a small sack of grain on the table and reached for a cup. "You need water," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plain observation. Naya accepted the cup, feeling the cool liquid ease the dryness in her throat. The simple act grounded her. It felt strange to be offered something without strings attached, without suspicion or demand. Richard sat in the chair closest to the window, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. For the first time since she arrived, she saw fatigue around his eyes. Not weakness, but the wear of years spent shouldering burdens alone. She realized he might not be as distant as he seemed. His silence came from habit, not indifference. She watched him for a moment before asking, "Why do you live out here?" He hesitated, considering how much of his past to reveal. "Quiet suits me," he finally said. "I had family once. Things changed. This place made sense after that." Naya absorbed his words, recognizing the heaviness behind them. She didn't press for details. She understood loss without needing specifics. Richard stood again and reached for his tools. "Fence on the north side needs checking. If you want to stay inside, that's fine." "I'll walk," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. He didn't question her reasoning. He simply nodded and led the way toward the ridge that bordered the ranch. The path wound through dry brush, giving a wide view of the land below. Naya walked slightly behind him, studying the shape of the hills, the openness of the terrain, the faint trails left by deer. Halfway up the ridge, she paused to catch her breath. Richard stopped immediately and looked back. "You all right?" She nodded, forcing her breathing into a calm rhythm. The climb had stirred memories she tried to silence. Memories of being driven through rough country with her movement controlled by others. But this time, no one pushed her. No one hurried her. She walked because she chose to. At the top, the wind shifted, carrying a cooler current over the ridge. Richard inspected the fence line, running a calloused hand along the beam. "No breaks," he said. "Good for now." Naya stood beside him, watching the valley below. The ranch looked small from above. One house, one barn, a few scattered cattle. But the air around it felt stable in a way she had not felt in months. "Your land is wide," she said. "Too wide for one person," he answered quietly. The statement landed between them with a weight neither spoke aloud. As they descended the ridge, Richard walked slower than before, matching her pace without drawing attention to it. Naya noticed but said nothing. It was the first small gesture of care she allowed herself to acknowledge. When they reached the yard, the day had settled into late afternoon light, casting long lines across the ground. Richard stopped near the porch and removed his gloves. "You did enough work for one day," he said, voice steady. Naya looked toward the house, feeling a strange, unfamiliar ease settle in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but something close to relief. For the first time, she stepped inside without hesitation. Richard lingered outside a moment longer, watching the sky shift colors. He didn't know why he felt lighter than he had in years. But something about the quiet presence inside his home changed the shape of the day. Neither of them said it aloud, but for the first time, the ranch felt like it held more than survival. It held possibility. The evening settled slowly over the ranch, turning the sky into a muted slate blue as crickets began their scattered calls across the dry grass. The air cooled just enough to ease the day's heat, drifting softly through the open window of the house. Naya sat at the table with a small scrap of cloth in her hands, stitching a tear in one of Richard's work shirts. The job wasn't required. She simply needed something steady for her fingers to do, something that kept her mind from circling the darker edges of her past. Richard entered a few minutes later, wiping dust from his hands with a worn towel. His shirt clung slightly to his back from the last of the day's labor. He dropped the towel near the basin, then sat heavily on the chair closest to the stove. The wooden legs creaked beneath his weight, breaking the quiet in a gentle, familiar way. For several moments, neither spoke. The soft scrape of Naya's needle and the distant call of a night bird filled the space between them. Richard leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees, studying the floorboards as though trying to gather thoughts he rarely voiced. Naya stole a glance at him, catching the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, lines carved by years of carrying burdens no one else saw. "How long have you been alone here?" she asked, her voice steady but low. He lifted his gaze to her, surprised she wanted an answer. Most people avoided personal questions with him. He was not known for encouraging conversation, but something about her tone made him consider honesty. "Almost 10 years," he said. "My brother and I owned more land back then. We tried making something bigger of it. Didn't go the way we planned." Naya set the needle down, waiting. Richard exhaled slowly, as though releasing words he hadn't used in years. "There was trouble with riders passing through. Fights we didn't start. My brother took a bullet that winter. I buried him behind the ridge. After that, I sold off most of the land. Stayed here because it was the only place that still felt familiar." Naya absorbed his confession with a quiet seriousness. His voice had not wavered, but she sensed the strain beneath it. Loss changed the way people stood, breathed, even slept. She recognized that kind of wound. She picked up the cloth again. "I lost my family too," she said. "Not in one day. In pieces. Taken, moved, traded. Some survived longer than others. I escaped when I could, but not soon enough to keep myself from ending up at that post." The room grew still. Richard did not ask for more. He didn't need details to understand the weight she carried. He sat back in his chair, hands loosely clasped. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Nobody comes looking for trouble in this stretch." Naya considered his words carefully. Safety was something she evaluated constantly, adjusting her expectations based on tone, posture, and history. His statement wasn't a promise meant to impress her. It was a factual observation from a man who meant what he said. Her chest tightened with a bittersweet ache. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to rest. But the instinct to remain alert still clung to her ribs. She folded the repaired shirt and set it on the table. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, meeting his eyes without flinching. Richard took his time answering, choosing each word with deliberate care. "You looked like you didn't deserve what was happening, and I didn't want to leave you there." He paused. It wasn't charity. It just felt wrong to walk away. Naya studied him, looking for hidden motives. She found none. His explanation was simple and unadorned, grounded in a straightforward morality that surprised her. Most men she had encountered made choices based on power or gain. Richard acted because something in him refused to ignore cruelty. She nodded slowly, accepting his answer not because she was ready to trust, but because it aligned with everything she had observed of him so far. Richard stood and grabbed the pot hanging near the stove. "I'll warm supper," he said, filling it with beans and water. His movements were careful, not rushed, as if the routine steadied him too. Naya watched from the table. The firelight illuminated his face, highlighting the lines of a man shaped by responsibility and solitude. He handled the pot with practiced ease, stirring occasionally while keeping an eye on the flame. "You don't speak much," she said after a moment. He half shrugged. "Words don't fix things. Work does." His blunt honesty brought a faint, almost unnoticeable pull at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, just a softening. When the food was ready, he set a portion in front of her, then served himself. They ate quietly, but the silence no longer felt tense or cold. It carried a growing mutual understanding, the the kind that formed slowly through shared space and steady behavior. After supper, Richard stepped outside to check the sky. Naya followed to the doorway, watching him scan the land with the instinct of someone expecting riders even when none were near. "Anything out there?" she asked. "Just wind," he replied. He stood for a moment longer, hands resting on his hips, breathing in the dry night air. Naya observed how he positioned himself slightly between her and the open land, subtle, instinctive, not possessive, but protective. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cool air settle against her skin. "This place, it's quiet," she said. "Quiet's why I stayed," Richard answered. Their eyes met in the half-light, not with intensity or longing, but with a shared recognition. Two people who had been shaped by violent histories now stood in a space where nothing demanded they run or defend themselves. For the first time since arriving, Naya felt a small, fragile piece of herself loosen, a guarded part she thought had hardened permanently. Richard closed the door gently when they returned inside. The night settled around the ranch, not as a threat, but as a rare moment of calm neither of them had known for a long time. And something subtle but unmistakable had shifted between them. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Quiet mornings, long hours of work, and cautious conversations shared only when necessary. Yet underneath that calm routine, something new began to shape itself, something neither Richard nor Naya understood at first. It started with small changes in Naya's body. At dawn one morning, she stepped outside to gather kindling and felt an unexpected heaviness in her limbs. The air was cool, carrying a thin mist that clung to the grass, but sweat still gathered at the back of her neck. She steadied herself against the porch railing, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When her breath returned to normal, she continued toward the woodpile, pretending nothing was wrong. She didn't tell Richard, not yet. She needed time to understand it herself. Inside the barn, Richard brushed down the mare, the soft scrape of bristles echoing in the quiet space. He noticed Naya's slower movements when she carried an armload of broken branches past the door. Her steps, usually measured and controlled, carried a slight drag. Her face looked paler than usual, with a faint tension around her mouth. "You feeling all right?" he asked, pausing mid-stroke. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the wood and continued walking as though she hadn't heard him. When she returned for another load, he stepped closer, blocking her path but leaving enough distance so she wouldn't feel cornered. "You look tired," he said in a plain, unhurried tone. "I'm fine," she replied. The words came out stiff, shaped more by habit than truth. Richard watched her for a long moment, weighing whether to push further. He decided not to. Pressure rarely produced honesty from someone who spent their life surviving through silence. He finished tending the mare and moved on to the cattle in the lower field, giving her the space she needed. Still, he kept an eye on her throughout the day, observing how often she paused to steady herself or how she leaned against the well for support after hauling water. By late afternoon, her steps wavered again while she lifted a bucket. Richard set down his tools and approached. "You should sit," he said. "I can work," she replied, forcing strength into her voice. Richard's brow tightened slightly. "You don't need to do everything," he said. "Nothing here is worth you falling over." Her posture stiffened, a mix of defensiveness and fear flickering across her face. She disliked feeling watched. She disliked being told what she could or couldn't manage. But she also knew her body was no longer behaving the way she expected. She set the bucket down carefully, her hands trembling for a brief moment before she hid them behind her back. Richard didn't press. Instead, he walked toward the house. "Come inside. Shade's cooler." Inside, the stove radiated a faint warmth left over from the morning's fire. Naya sank onto a chair, pressing her palm to her forehead. Richard poured water into a tin cup and set it beside her without asking questions. She drank slowly, her throat tightening as she tried to swallow past the anxiety rising inside her. He pulled out a crate from under the counter and sat on it, giving her time. After several minutes, she finally spoke. "My stomach, it feels different." Richard's eyes flickered with concern. Sick? No, not sick, just pulling. Heavy. Her hand instinctively rested on her midsection, her fingers spreading across her abdomen. Recognition flashed through her expression, though she didn't voice it yet. Richard read the change. He had seen enough women in nearby settlements to understand the signs. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. You think you might be carrying? The question hung in the air, quiet and direct. Naya's chest tightened, fear rising like a sudden pressure against her ribs. Pregnancy had never represented hope for her, only vulnerability and danger. She stared at the floor, unable to form an answer. Richard waited, giving her the silence she needed. I don't know, she whispered. Maybe. He nodded once. If you are, then we make things easier. You won't be lifting heavy work. Her head snapped up at that. You don't know if it's true. I don't, he agreed. But you're hurting. That's enough reason to slow down. No accusation. No suspicion. No questions about her past. Just a straightforward concern she hadn't expected. Naya's throat tightened. She hated how unsteady her emotions felt, how quickly her mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. A child meant survival challenges, dependency, and potential rejection. It meant being judged, used, or discarded. She lowered her gaze again, her brow furrowing as she fought to keep her fears from spilling over. Richard stood and placed a cup of fresh water in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't hover, didn't assume he had the right to guide her choices. He simply stood close enough to offer steadiness without pressure. Rest a day, he said evenly. I'll handle the rest of the work. She looked at him sharply. Why are you helping me? He didn't answer right away. He searched for the right words, finally saying, because you're here, and you shouldn't face this alone. Naya stared at him, trying to determine whether he meant it. Something in his posture, solid, unshaken, grounded in simple decency, told her he wasn't lying. The tension in her shoulders lessened by a fraction, though she still held herself guarded. Richard stepped outside to fetch more water, leaving her in the quiet house where the air smelled faintly of dry wood and worn fabric. She placed a hand over her abdomen again, this time not in fear, but in cautious curiosity. Outside, Richard filled the bucket slowly, his jaw tight. He didn't fear the possibility of a child. He feared mishandling a situation that could determine the safety of the only person who had entered his world with no expectation other than survival. When he returned inside, he found Naya sitting more upright, her expression steadying. Take your time, he said. We'll figure it out. The words were simple, but they carried more reassurance than anything she had heard in months. For the first time, she believed she might not have to face the future alone. The next morning arrived with a cool breeze sweeping in from the northern ridge, stirring loose dust around the yard. Richard stepped outside before full daylight, checking the sky for signs of incoming weather. The air felt sharp and clean, good conditions for finishing the repairs he had planned. He tightened the cinch on his saddle, preparing to ride the fence line, but something made him pause. Naya moved slowly across the porch, one hand resting on the doorframe as if grounding herself before stepping into open space. Her face held a faint strain, the kind that came from a body adjusting to something new. Richard lowered the reins, watching carefully without making herself conscious. Morning, he said in a calm tone. She nodded, her eyes scanning the yard for anything unfamiliar before focusing on him. You're leaving early. Fence on the far side needs looking at, he replied. Shouldn't take long. Naya glanced at the saddlebag strapped to the mare. Richard followed her gaze and added, I'll be back before midday. She didn't ask to join him. Her body wouldn't handle that distance today, but she didn't want to stay completely idle either. She stepped off the porch and reached for the bucket near the well. I can handle a few chores, she said. You don't have to push yourself, he reminded her. She tightened her grip on the handle. I can do some things. Not all. Richard studied her expression. Determination, not pride, guided her words. He gave a single nod. If anything feels wrong, you stop. She didn't promise, but she didn't dismiss the warning. As he mounted the mare, Naya watched him ride out, dust rising behind him in a thin trail that faded as he moved toward the ridge. With him gone, the ranch felt larger, quieter, more exposed. Naya stood still for a long moment, letting the silence settle around her before forcing her body into motion. She filled the bucket, carrying it to the trough in slow, controlled steps. Each movement sent a slight pull through her abdomen, a reminder of the possibility she still hadn't fully accepted. She paused beside the corral, pressing her palm to the fence rail as a wave of fatigue washed through her. The cattle moved lazily in the shade, flicking their tails at flies. Their calmness grounded her. She stayed there until her breathing evened out again. Inside the house, she sat at the table and rested her forehead against her arm. She wasn't sick. Her body was simply shifting, demanding more energy than she had allowed herself to admit. For years, survival meant ignoring discomfort, pushing past warning signs. Now, the stakes were different. Her hand drifted to her stomach. A faint tightness radiated from deep within, not painful, just unfamiliar. A slow realization crept in, quiet but undeniable. If life was forming inside her, the future she had feared might no longer be a distant threat. It might be her reality. A knock at the door startled her back into the present. She stiffened instantly, muscles tensing, breath catching in her throat. No one ever knocked here. Richard hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. She rose carefully, keeping silent steps as she approached the window. She tilted the curtain back a fraction and spotted a lone figure standing in the yard, a woman from a nearby homestead, one of the few settlers who occasionally crossed Richard's path. Gray hair in a loose braid, hands rough from work, a calm face worn by years of weather and hardship. Naya didn't know her name. They had never spoken. The woman noticed movement inside and lifted a small basket. Naya hesitated before opening the door halfway. "Brought some greens from my garden," the woman said, her tone friendly but not intrusive. "He traded me a file last month. Figured I'd return the favor." Naya didn't reach for the basket immediately. She kept her weight set, ready to close the door if needed. The woman seemed to understand. Her gaze softened. "You're staying here now," she said simply, not as a question, but as an observation. Naya nodded once. "No trouble," the woman added gently. "Just wanted to say welcome." Naya took the basket cautiously, her fingers brushing the rough woven edge. The woman gave a small, reassuring smile and walked back toward the trail without asking anything else. The encounter left Naya unsettled, not from danger, but from the unexpected kindness. She wasn't used to receiving anything without suspicion attached. She set the basket on the table and stepped back, unsure what to feel. Hours later, Richard returned, riding into the yard with dust coating his hat and boots. Naya stood on the porch, watching him dismount. He noticed immediately how the basket sat on the table inside. "Someone came by," he said, studying her face. "A woman," Naya replied. "She brought food. That'd be Martha. She's harmless," Richard assured her. "Keeps mostly to herself." Naya absorbed his explanation without comment. He stepped inside, removing his gloves. "How are you feeling now?" "Tired," she admitted, "but better than earlier." Richard nodded, relief passing briefly through his expression before he masked it. "Good." The rest of the day unfolded quietly. He sorted the greens into a pot while she swept dust from the floor. Their movements carried a subtle awareness of each other, an unspoken check-in every time their paths crossed. Not dependency, not discomfort, something new, something steady. That night, after supper, Naya sat near the bed while Richard fixed a loose hinge on a cabinet. She watched his precise, controlled movements. "Richard," she said softly. He set the tool down and looked at her. "If I am carrying," she began carefully, "you should know." He waited. "I don't know what this will mean for you." He studied her for a long, steady moment. Then he said, "If you are, then we take it one day at a time. I won't turn you away, and I won't make you face it alone." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected certainty from him. Not like this. Richard stood and moved toward the stove to add a small piece of wood. "Whatever comes next, we handle it here," he said quietly. The weight she had carried all day lifted slightly, not gone, but no longer hers alone. For the first time in months, She felt the ground beneath her feet settle instead of shifting. And Richard, watching her from the corner of the room with quiet resolve, felt something he hadn't allowed in years. A sense that his empty home was no longer empty. The next week brought colder mornings, the kind that sharpened the air and made every breath feel deliberate. A thin fog clung to the edges of the yard at sunrise, drifting between fence posts and settling around the barn roof. Richard stepped outside before the light strengthened, scanning the valley out of habit. Nothing moved except a pair of crows perched on the dead cottonwood. They scattered when he approached, their wings beating hard against the quiet. Inside the house, Naya sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of water. She had woken before dawn again, unable to ignore the steady pull in her abdomen. The sensation wasn't painful today, just a reminder that something inside her was changing day by day. Her breathing felt different too, deeper, slower, as if her body was preparing for work it hadn't done before. Richard entered with a small bundle of tools wrapped in old cloth. He set them down gently, avoiding loud sounds that might unsettle her. "I'll be in the barn," he said, adjusting his gloves. "If you need anything, call out." She nodded without lifting her eyes from the cup. She appreciated the reassurance, but didn't know how to respond to kindness in a way that felt natural. Silence became her safest answer. Once Richard left, the house grew still again. The stove warmed the room in soft waves, and a faint smell of ash clung to the air. Naya watched the dust float in the sunlight, her thoughts circling the uncertainty she hadn't yet spoken aloud. She didn't fear labor or hardship. She feared being unwanted once the truth became undeniable. Before doubt could settle deeper, she stood and gathered the blanket draped over the chair. Wrapping it around her shoulders, she walked outside, following the steady rhythm of Richard's hammer taps echoing from a barn. She reached the doorway quietly and saw him working on a long plank of pine. He measured each cut carefully, marking straight lines with a piece of charcoal. His concentration settled fully on the wood, jaw firm, shoulders squared, movements calm and controlled. The barn smelled of sawdust, hay, and the faint musk of cattle resting in the adjoining stall. "What are you making?" she asked from the doorway. He didn't startle. He finished his cut, set the plank aside, and wiped his hands on a rag. "A frame," he said, "needs to be sturdy." She stepped inside, looking at the pieces laid out on the floor. Curved sides, narrow slats, small notches carved with precise angles. Recognition arrived slowly, pressing warmth against her chest. A cradle, she realized. Richard didn't confirm it immediately. He picked up another board, checked its grain, and only then answered, "Figured it'd be best to start early. Gives me time to get it right." His tone remained steady, but a softness lingered under the words. Something careful, something deliberate. "You don't know for certain," she said, her voice low. "No," he agreed, but nothing wrong with preparing. Naya looked at the unfinished cradle, her hands curling gently at her sides. The idea of someone making something for her, something for a life she hadn't trusted yet, sent a wave of emotion she had no name for. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the smooth edge of the wood. It felt solid, warm from the morning's work. Richard watched her reaction quietly. He didn't step closer or offer reassurance. He simply let her absorb the moment. After a while, she said, "You don't have to do this." "I want to," he replied. The simplicity of his answer held more weight than any lengthy explanation could have. Naya swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind replayed the moments since he found her, each act considered, each gesture slow and without expectation. She sat on a hay bale near the wall. Richard returned to his tools, the rhythm of his work steadying both of them. She followed each strike of the hammer with her eyes, letting the repetition calm her unsettled thoughts. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting light in the barn and the scraping of wood against metal. Occasionally, Richard paused to stretch his back or take a sip of water. Once, he glanced at her, not checking on her condition, but acknowledging her presence in a quiet, respectful way. When the sun reached its highest point, he stepped back to examine the partially assembled cradle. It stood sturdy despite its unfinished edges, shaped by hands that valued careful work over speed. "It'll hold," he said, half to himself. Naya rose from her seat and approached him slowly. She rested her palm on the side of the cradle, feeling the subtle warmth left by his labor. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "It's good," she murmured. Richard gave a small nod, his gaze dropping to the wood. He didn't know how to respond to emotion, his own or anyone else's. But he understood effort, and he understood responsibility. "You should eat," he said after a moment. "I'll finish more of this later." Naya followed him outside. The midday heat had settled heavy over the yard, but a faint breeze carried the scent of dry grass across the open land. They walked side by side toward the house, their steps unhurried. Inside, she prepared a simple meal while he washed his hands at the basin. The quiet between them felt different now. No tension, no awkwardness, only a steady awareness of each other. While they ate, Naya asked softly, "What made you decide to build it?" He looked at the table, considering his answer. "You deserve a place for the child if there's one. And even if there isn't, making it doesn't harm anything." The honesty struck her harder than she expected. After the meal, she placed her hand unconsciously on her stomach. Richard noticed the motion but didn't comment. He only stood and reached for his hat. "I'll check the cattle," he said. She nodded. As he stepped outside, Naya remained seated at the table, staring at the doorway. A thought rose slowly, surprising her with its clarity. Richard wasn't preparing out of obligation. He was preparing because he intended to stay. She touched the cradle with still lingering under her fingertips, and for the first time since her life had been ripped from its place, a quiet sense of belonging began to take root, small, tentative, but undeniable. Nothing had been promised between them, yet something was forming all the same. Spring arrived with cautious steps, patches of green pushing through the dry soil, faint shoots along the fence line, birds returning in small, scattered groups. The days grew warmer, and the air carried a softness that hadn't been there during winter. The ranch, once quiet in a hollow way, now felt lived in. The changes were subtle but constant. A folded blanket left on the porch rail, herbs drying near the window, the cradle taking shape piece by piece in the barn. Naya moved more slowly now. Her body had changed in unmistakable ways, her steps careful, her breathing deeper. She no longer tried to hide the truth. There was no reason to. Richard treated her condition not with fear or hesitation, but with steady practicality. If she needed a chair, he pulled one over without comment. If she struggled with a chore, he stepped in without making her feel incapable. He didn't hover, but he didn't stray far either. One morning, Naya stood by the doorway, a hand resting firmly on the frame as she watched the yard brighten under sunrise. Small movements fluttered within her abdomen, steady, rhythmic reminders that she no longer lived only for herself. For a brief moment, nerves tightened her chest. She had never expected to bring a child into a place like this. She had certainly never expected to do so with a man who spoke more through actions than words. Behind her, Richard stepped inside from the morning air, brushing dirt from his hands. He noticed her posture, the quiet way she stood. "You all right?" She turned her head slightly. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then faced him fully. "What happens when the baby comes?" Richard walked closer, stopping at a respectful distance. His voice stayed steady. "We raised the child here. That's the plan, unless you want something different." Naya studied him, searching for any hint of uncertainty. She found none. His expression remained calm, grounded in a conviction that surprised her every time. "You're not worried?" she asked. "A little," he admitted, "but not about the wrong things. I can handle the work. I'm more concerned about making sure you're safe." His answer reached deeper than she expected. She placed a hand over her stomach, steadying the faint movement beneath her fingers. "I never thought I'd have a say in anything again." "You do here," he replied quietly. Later that day, Richard returned to the barn to sand the final board of the cradle. Sunlight streamed through the open doors, casting long, defined shapes across the floor. The cradle stood in the center, nearly finished, smooth edges, careful joints, a sturdy base that rocked gently when pushed. He ran his palm along the rounded rail, ensuring there were no splinters. Naya entered the barn slowly, her footsteps light despite her growing weight. She paused near the doorway, watching him work. "It looks finished," she said. "Almost," he replied. "Just need to tighten the joints." She approached the cradle and rested her hand on its side. The wood felt warm from the sun. "I never imagined having something built for me." "It's for both of you," he said. "You're not facing this alone." She looked up at him, her expression shifting with quiet emotion. "Why did you decide to take me from that post?" Richard stood still for a moment, his thoughts returning to the worn awning, the rope around her wrists, the way she stood like she feared showing vulnerability would invite more harm. "Because leaving you there didn't sit right with me. That's all." Naya absorbed his words slowly, her heart steadying in her chest. She didn't thank him openly. Gratitude felt too small for what he had given her. Instead, she reached out and touched the cradle again, her silent acknowledgement of everything he had done. By late afternoon, the cradle stood complete. Richard carried it into the house with careful movements, positioning it near the bed where the morning light would reach it. Naya followed him inside, her gaze fixed on the new addition to their world. "It belongs here," she said softly. Richard nodded. "So do you." Her breath caught. She wasn't used to certainty spoken aloud. It sounded final, not in a trapping way, but in a way that anchored her feet firmly to the floor. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun lowered, painting the valley in muted gold. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, hinting at tomorrow's rain. Naya leaned her shoulder lightly against the porch post, steadying her balance. Richard stood a step below, repairing a loose hinge on the railing. After a long stretch of quiet, Naya spoke. "I want to name the child when the time comes." He looked up. "Your choice." She nodded slowly. "Our choice," she corrected. Richard's gaze softened. He wasn't a man who sought affection, yet her words settled into him with unexpected warmth. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers before joining her at the top step. "What do you want for the child?" she asked. "A life without fear," he said. "A place to belong. Something neither of us had for a long time." Naya rested her hand gently on her stomach. "Then we stay here and build it." He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "Together," he added. As the last light faded from the valley, Richard stepped closer, not touching, but present, the way he had been from the first day he freed her. Naya shifted just enough for their shoulders to almost align, their closeness no longer hesitant but chosen. The house behind them held a finished cradle, the first true sign of a shared future. The land ahead offered stability, not danger. And the two who had once walked alone now stood side by side, no longer bound by survival alone, but by the life they had chosen to build. Naya exhaled softly, letting the weight of her past fall away piece by piece. Richard watched the horizon with quiet resolve. Their new family, small, unplanned, and anchored in mutual choice, had already begun. And from this moment on, neither of them would face anything alone ever again.